So I'm doing a lot of work with partners who have been pioneering this work with me on the development, validation, and importantly the implementation of patient-reported outcome measures. Now these are very important because in palliative care we have to make sure that we understand what matters to the patient, and we have to be able to, very importantly, show that what we do makes a difference. So like any other field of health, we have to demonstrate that when patients access our services, we can improve their outcomes. Now, standard health outcome measures don't work in palliative care because they'll be maybe just about physical function or about recovery. Of course, our patients don't recover. The endpoint for everybody will be death at some point. So we need to measure what matters to people who have palliative care needs. So whether that's their pain, other symptoms, anxiety, depression, information, spiritual well-being, family support. So we've developed the palliative care outcome scale about 20 years ago, led by Irene Higginson. And that work's been embedded across the UK, so we realised that actually low and middle income countries where resources are scarce really have to be able to make sure that they can measure their effectiveness. So we started in sub-Saharan Africa, that's been rolled out with the African Palliative Care Association, and now we're working in Jordan with the King Hussein Cancer Centre to look at outcomes in the context of conflict and refugees. So the important thing with an outcome scale in palliative care is it has to be brief. So the brief measure that we've developed in low middle income countries is easily usable in practice. That's really, really important. It's got to be useful for staff, and they tell us that it helps them assess, that it's brief and it covers all the things they want to discuss with the patient. Patients like it because it enables them to make sure that they're able to discuss what matters and what they want to raise with the clinician. So the outcome measure has actually been well embedded into practice, and Julia with the African Palliative Care Association has been leading the children's version, and I'm delighted to say we're now going to be taking that learning from Africa and developing a UK version of the children's palliative care outcome scale for use across Europe. And this is really cutting edge science. No high-income country had yet developed an outcome measure for children. It came first from Africa, and I think that's great leadership. The exciting thing is what we've learnt from low middle income countries. So what we learnt there was the focus on spiritual well-being. What's really interesting, we'd used other measures which showed that patients weighted spiritual well-being more importantly than anything else. So we developed there the measure of being at peace, or the item to go in the measure of being at peace. And interestingly, that's now been translated back into the UK version, because patients in the UK decided they really liked it. So it's another example of what we've learnt in Africa actually had great relevance for the UK. So this information transfer is a really exciting part of the work that we do in global health palliative care. And I think what they've done really, really well, particularly in Africa, has been to make the use of a measure a standard of quality care. So you take the example of South Africa, all of their hospices are accredited, independently accredited, and if you want to be a 5-star hospice, which is the highest quality ranking you can get, you have to be using an outcome measure in routine practice. And of course the outcome measure they use is the African POS. But in the UK we don't have that requirement to measure outcomes. Many people do, but it's not a requirement. But in Africa it is. And the African Palliative Care Association sets standards based around the results of outcome measurement. So there's real innovation which I think we can all learn from. I have to say my experience has been with my fantastic partners that I work with that there's a real keenness to engage in research, a real keenness to engage in data collection activities and to prove worth. And I think there's something about there being a smaller field of palliative care specialist staff. So actually there has to be more of a generalist approach, so enabling people to use the simple assessment tool can improve access. And I think also when people are fighting for funding and there are limited resources, if you're able to use a measure and prove that you're being effective, and you've got a greater chance of having some of those resources allocated to palliative care. We've had a fantastic panel, really exciting panel on outcome measurement. Full room of people coming to talk about outcome measurement, which is another really good sign about where we're at in terms of evidence of what we do. So Deb Dudgeon from Canada is leading a fantastic international consensus working group on outcome measurement to understand what people are using, what the different properties are of different tools, what domains they cover. with a goal of kind of trying to bring the world together to use a smaller number of recommended tools rather than everybody using something different. So Deb's doing great work on that. We had Liz Gwither, who told the story of outcome measurement in South Africa and how it's driving forward quality assessment, how it's driving forward clinical practice, and some of the research evidence that's showing that clinicians are finding it an incredibly useful and simple tool to help them to do their basic clinical assessment and to show how patients are changing over time and to inform their care planning. Then Julia Downing from the International Children's Palliative Care Network, who's been leading so much work on children's outcome measurement, which is completely unique in the world. And then we also had Omar Shamir from the King Hussein Cancer Centre, and he's looking at the adaptation of measures and quality improvement for displaced people and refugees, because the work he's doing is quite unique in the sense that people at the end of life who are refugees may be having additional psychological needs, there may be revisited trauma, but there's also a fracture from your social support network. That's a good question. There's a couple of really important points I think that came through in the discussion afterwards, because there are a number of questions from the floor. First thing is, when you present something like an outcome measure for routine practice, the first thing clinicians will, of course, think this is another thing to do in the day and I'm already too burdened. So we're able to make the point very clearly that from the research evidence, if you use an outcome measure on your routine practice, it enables you to very quickly focus down on what matters right now to this patient and to respond to that. And actually you can do things like reduce readmissions and any exacerbation of problems if you identify them early. So there's a saving there. But I think what also was great in the meeting that demonstrated to the room is that you can implement routine outcome measures and it helps your service, it supports the staff, it supports the patient, and it's, rather than being a hindrance, it's a help. And it actually has shown that these services can demonstrate how well they're doing, which is what we all need to do.